This lesson is the second of two on the book of Leviticus, a book that needs more of a bird's eye view than a dissection, which, if you want the dissection, you can look at Constable's notes. But we will cover three main topics: defilement laws, sabbatical and jubilee years, and tithes. For the defilement laws, I've got chapter 12 up here. You may need to scroll around on your own, but generally speaking, any body secretion that could be considered a life liquid caused defilement. On the positive side, such laws gave people time to rest and heal since they couldn't do their normal religious and civic duties. So we shouldn't think of this as a shaming thing against people. Instead, it not only gives them rest, but also honors God as absolutely holy and perfect. So they would have time to sit and reflect on, why it is that they couldn't do certain things while they rested and recuperated. Now, regarding uncleanness after childbirth, there is no dancing around the fact that the time of being unclean was twice as long for giving birth to a girl as it was for a boy. Not surprisingly, many take this as a statement of inferiority of being or essence on the part of females, because another lowest of sinners has been brought into the world, and this is some kind of punishment or reminder of, to know your place. But our study of Genesis 3 should have put any such notion to rest. And besides, the baby itself is not called unclean. How can the mother be unclean but not the baby? I mean, women are designed to give birth, and God's first words to the first couple were, "Be fruitful and multiply." So this is not any kind of curse or punishment on a woman. A less misogynistic view holds that the mother would want more bonding time with a baby girl, yet this makes little sense unless she expects the baby to be quickly sold as a slave or something, since women were segregated in society and spent their lives mainly with other women. So why would they need more bonding time with the girl than the boy? That doesn't make any sense. And as a mother of boys myself, I can tell you that bonding time doesn't care whether the baby wears pink or blue. So I reject those two arguments. And can we really think that the God who promised Eve that her seed would defeat the serpent's seed would turn around and demean all her seed forever? And did women in ancient Near East culture even need God to make sure they knew their place? They were already held into it, very forcefully. The simple fact is that God hasn't told us why he's done a lot of things that he's done, and we have to trust him to have valid reasons, not to make up our own, or to use his silence to excuse putting one half the human race over the other. But if we go down to chapter 27, I'll have to type that in because it's too far to scroll. We'll see about this vow price, because we see the same difference again. A female vow price, for lack of a better term, is significantly less than the price for a male, especially verses 2 and 7 you can see there. Why would that be? This was essentially putting a value on a person's life. So is God saying that men outvalue women? Not at all. He's saying that society valued men's lives more because of their earning potential and the monetary value lost if the person died. In other words, it wasn't as much of a financial hit to lose a female than to lose a male. That's just the reality of the society in that culture and time. And again, God is regulating, not ordaining these things. He's regulating them. So then, Paul to Timothy, these are used to browbeat women all the time, but in 1 Timothy 1:9, Paul said that the law is not for the righteous, but for the sinful. So in these laws of Moses, the purpose is to deal with sinners, to keep them from going too far astray. Remember the illustration of people pulling the cart up the hill. What we should conclude from this is not that God made women as inferiors to men, but that sin needs to be kept on a leash. As I've said before, it's a step, not the whole staircase. And again, as I said before, when we get to the New Testament post-cross, post-ascension, and post all the letters teaching us how to behave as Christians, there is no excuse for continuing this many centuries and millennia later on things that we've had plenty of time to get up the staircase with. But that's what people do. They like to stay in certain spots. Now, by this time, those who are convinced that God is indeed a respecter of persons on the basis of flesh will have concluded that I'm some kind of what I would call the Christian F word, a feminist. They seem to fear that equality of being is a slippery slope to all kinds of heathen beliefs and practices. But the fact is that this is a study of the Bible, not of me, and it isn't God who ever intended to put one person over another. He's just working through and around us. Now, if we go to, let's skip back to chapter 18, and as further evidence of what I'm saying, take note of the fact that biblical equality does not advocate the murder of babies, nor the practice of sexual deviancy in any way. In verses 23 through 29, we can see that what God really thinks of homosexuality and bestiality. They are detestable, perverted, and disgusting. And the penalty under the laws of Moses was death. Unlike the blending of fabrics or eating certain animals, this type of sin, like murder or theft, is clearly a line that not even Gentiles are to cross. So there is no slippery slope. If anyone is respecting the Bible at all, they have to respect it all, and it does not teach inferiority of being, and there is no role-playing beyond what any of us play, because a role, by definition, is something you can stop doing. You cannot stop being who you are. You cannot stop being male or female, no matter how hard anybody tries. So those are not roles. You can play a role as either a mother or father, depending on your biology, or a husband or wife. But a difference, a hierarchy in permission is not intrinsic to a person's flesh. And by the way, if anyone's still looking for an excuse to shoot the messenger, I'm also not a socialist, just to get that out of the way. Now, before we move on to the next topic, we might be wondering why it is in all these laws that secreted blood and other fluids is unclean, but sacrificed blood is cleansing. That seems to be a contradiction. But as Constable's notes points out, the difference is that the sacrificed blood represents the giving of one healthy life for another, instead of the issuing of blood being due to some disease or temporary physical condition. All right, now let's move on to sabbatical and jubilee years. So now let's go to chapter 25. And there were two kinds of Sabbath rest years for the land itself. And again, we're talking about physical land. One was every 7th year, and there was a special one every 7 times 7 years, or the 49th year, also called the jubilee year. In both cases, the people could harvest whatever grew, but they could not plow or prune. For the jubilee, there were to be also trumpet blasts on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is roughly our October, 7th from the beginning of their year, which was March, April. But if we can go down here to verse 13, on the Jubilee year, all the land reverted to its original tribe. Because of that, the sale price of any land between Jubilees was to be prorated to the number of years remaining, which again shows that the land was leased rather than truly bought and sold on the basis of how many harvests a person could get out of it. Now, if we go down to verse 25, it says that land could also be sold to what is called a kinsman redeemer if a poor person really needed the cash, so the land could stay in the family. That's what the kinsman part of it is, stays in the family. And so a clan must not turn a blind eye on the poor among their own people in their own clan, but they were obligated, if they were able, to help those less well off. And then in verse 35, we can see that the same principle applied to Hebrew slaves who were sold because of poverty, and these were to be released on the Jubilee year just as the land was. Neither was interest to be charged to fellow Hebrews, because no profit was to be made on the backs of any of them who were in poverty. That is to say, the people were not to take advantage of each other, and because they were related by blood, these are your brothers, and there were proselytes and converts and slaves and so forth, but citizens of Israel, were not to put each other under an interest-bearing loan of any sort. Now, at this point, I can hear the critics muttering about Jews and money, but do we not give things to our relatives that we would otherwise sell to outsiders? Do we give the same rights and privileges to foreigners that we give to citizens? If any of you have owned a business or been in a family that owned a business, there are certain perks that you get just for being family. But, of course, that needs to be kept on a leash as well and not abused. Whereas people who, and even employees get employee discounts, but customers don't get any of that. That's the same principle here. And to be fair, per another link in the description about Jews and money, it was the early state church that pushed the Jews into banking and finance in the first place. Since the state church took such a strong stance against charging interest, but needed it to finance their business, they thought God wouldn't mind if they used the Jews to do their banking for them, their dirty work. And that's the same mentality that they used also to justify the use of state military power to enforce religious compliance. In both cases, they thought they'd be off the hook because they delegated their dirty work. So their idea was that if we have someone else who doesn't have any qualms about something, do something we need done that we can't because of our own rules, that's okay. This is not at all unlike the Pharisees who legalistically wouldn't take back Judas' betrayal fee of 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, because it was blood money. It's ironic. If you read that account, Judas threw the money back at them, and they said, well, we can't put this in a treasury. It's blood money. That's why they bought that field where he hung himself and so forth. But the point is their legalism to a fault had nothing to do with ethics or morality or even sense half the time. So it was all about legal loopholes rather than principles of ethics and morality. And this solution of the state church eventually led to the invention of international banking, first with the Medici family. They predated the Rothschilds by a couple hundred years, but likely served as a prototype for what has become a monstrous oppressive entity over the whole world. So before we point fingers at the Jews, we need to ask who really created this monster. All right, now let's go to tithes. And we'll just scroll down here to chapter 27. And we can see here that there was an annual harvest tithe that was done on increase or profit from crops and herds, not any and all income on anything else people had or their wages. That's not what this was about. And it wasn't from anyone who wasn't a landowner who gained the profit. Landowner, business owner, whatever. You, as the profit maker, are the one who paid a tithe, not the employees. Okay, so if you in Israel did not have land, you did not tithe. And the tithe was paid to the temple, so the landless Levites would have food. Also, you can reference Numbers 18 and Chronicles 31 for more details on that. There was also an annual tithe for all of the people, not just the Levites, who would give a tenth of that tithe to the Levites and poor, then take the rest and consume it themselves at the temple. From the description in Deuteronomy 12, 4 through 19, and 14, 22 through 27, and 26, 10 to 11, that's all in Deuteronomy, it was essentially a huge national holiday. Notice especially if you go to check Deuteronomy 14, and let me just go there because I think it's important to see this, that down in verses 25 and 26, this big party included alcoholic beverages. There's no escaping it. It's strong drink. There you are. But the point is that this tithe was consumed by the people who gave it. But they did it in a certain place to give glory to God for all his blessings. And on top of that, there was a tithe every third year, especially for the poor, a charity tithe, and it was collected in local towns instead of the one temple to keep basically what are food banks and keep them stocked. This too is not described here but in Deuteronomy in chapters 14 and 26, and there's a nice infographic about all this at the link in the description. So looking back on what we just said about tithing, you will never hear a church sermon on tithing from the New Testament because it isn't there. It can't be there. Nothing ever connects a local church to the temple of Israel, or pastors to the priesthood, or the wholesale replacement of food with money, much less putting a guilt trip on all working class people to tithe their paychecks. Tithing as we know it wasn't officially demanded until about the mid-500s AD, and it flies in the face of Paul's explicit teaching in 2 Corinthians 8:8-15, and 9:6-7. It's impossible to give, not tithe, but give without compulsion, as Paul stated there, when it's demanded as a requirement to support an organization's staff and property, or when people are threatened with God's curses if they don't fork it over. Christians are to be generous, but this cannot and must not be enforced by anyone else. It has to come from your heart. Paul said so. This is impossible if you're being browbeaten by some preacher going to Malachi or some of these books about the law, because they can't do it from the New Testament. So Leviticus is not a bucket of proof text for control freaks to use against Christians, nor is it a weapon of oppression and cold-bloodedness, as the critics allege, against the people of Israel. It simply governed the civic and religious life of the agrarian nation of Israel, so they could enjoy God's blessings in the land, as well as remember the hard lessons of the past. It looked forward, it looked back, and it looked at the present, and had to do with blessings and curses and remembering who God is, and God does keep his promises, but there are prices to pay if you try to push him too far in that. But above all, they reminded Israel on a daily basis what it means to be in good standing with a holy God and to be considerate of others, including animals and property, and even the land itself. All of it, even their own lives, were the property of God, who was graciously allowing them to lease it. This was the relationship, the proper connection between God and people, which underlaid every aspect of Hebrew life. If they understood and accepted this relationship, they would behave accordingly, which is a shadow of the coming age of grace. People don't understand salvation now, let alone then, but more than salvation, they don't understand that the key to both testaments is the relationship. We're talking about a parent-child kind of relationship, as I mentioned at the beginning of the illustration of a child who broke a neighbor's window. We're the children in that scenario, although we as adults are fully capable of being responsible for our moral choices. But the point is that just as in these laws of Moses, or the laws of Levi, however you want to say it, that the whole point of it was to remember that God is God and we're not, and there are certain things you do and don't do because of that, and that you are grateful children who have been rescued by a parent, got off the hook for paying the window. In the same way, in the New Testament, in the age of grace, we have a relationship, and if we understand and accept that relationship and that we have been redeemed, then we should act accordingly. So I can only hope and trust that these two lessons have shed some light on what is otherwise a largely ignored and abused portion of Scripture.